Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to yet another RedGamingTech.com video, and we're going to be talking more about the PlayStation 4 and the possible difficulties the system could be facing during its lifetime. These could be several different factors actually. One could be competition, for example from Sony and Microsoft, as well as other competitors that could possibly be jumping into the marketplace, as well as Sony's own issues. So, first of all, I think the first thing we should discuss is, of course, the competitors. Now, all eyes at the moment are on Microsoft, and it's definitely going to be a very interesting time when they announce formally the Xbox 720, or whatever it ends up to be called, of course. The Orbis was the name, of course, for the PS4 until, well, just recently, and then, of course, it was formerly known as PS4, so who knows what the Xbox will actually be called. Regardless, what we will know is that the Xbox 720 will mark a very important conference, not just for Microsoft themselves, as after all they have to prove themselves worthy competitors to the PlayStation 4, but for Sony as well, as they'll know more about what they're facing. Now, no doubt they do have some industrial espionage going on, and I'm not exactly going to be surprised if they know roughly the specifications and know roughly some of the plans that Microsoft are going to be kind of hatching. However, what they are not going to be able to judge is just all of this stuff. After all, even if they do have certain spies working for them, and I'm not saying they do, I'm just assuming they might, that doesn't mean that they're going to have, of course, all the answers. More to the point, it doesn't mean that they're going to know how, say, some of the developers are going to be reacting to the Xbox 720, and it certainly doesn't mean anything compared to how the public is going to react to the Xbox 720. Now, there's not just Microsoft, of course. Everyone's writing off or forgetting about Nintendo, and you can't do that. As I've mentioned several times before, at the end of the day, they are charging money for their hardware, and they do have games on the system. In other words, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to buy a Wii U and, say, a PS4, or a Wii U and an Xbox 720. You might just buy a Wii U, particularly if you're, say, a PC gamer, or you're not that into gaming. In other words, they're still competing in the same marketplace. Moreover, you also have to remember that many industry analysts are expecting, or almost fearful in some ways, of Apple jumping into the market as well. And then, of course, you've got mobile gaming, and by that, of course, I'm talking about tablets and other such devices which could possibly, more than likely, hook up to your television and so on, as well as various other smaller console designs. For example, the Game Stick, and of course the Ouya, which of course is getting ready and close to launch. By the way, we will be covering the Ouya. Spoonie Kipper is actually having one sent to his house fairly soon, actually. I think he's in one of the first production runs. Regardless, I'm kind of getting off topic. So the PS4 is definitely going to be heavily under competition. There's no doubt about it. As I've mentioned before, previously in another video, there wasn't too long ago that there was only really 3 competitors in the marketplace. Now it's not that case at all. Of course, we no longer have Sega there, but we do have other competitors that are more than likely want to steal a march on the hardware market. After all, it's worth a lot of cash. So there's the competition side of things. So I think we've talked a little bit about that. We'll probably go back into that in a moment. But let's also talk about what the PS4 could fail by itself. In other words, no help at all. Now, the good news with the PlayStation 4 is it seems it's pretty darn easy to program for, and this is a very big problem with quite a few consoles. The Sega Saturn had this. I'll probably talk about the Saturn actually in this completely separate videos. I really love that era of gaming, but the Sega Saturn was fairly unique in its design. It had 2 CPUs, as I mentioned before, and it turns out that they kind of sucked with how they not only put the console together, but more to the point, the tools they actually developed to actually program for the console. So, in other words, not only was the environment difficult, but it was even more difficult because the tools weren't up to scratch. So there was only, I believe, I even heard the number 100 people out of all the developers on the Sega Saturn and all the different companies. So there's only around 100 that fully understood the hardware enough to be able to actually make use of it. And you can imagine just how bad that was. So regardless, of course, the PS3 also had its share of issues as well. Many people couldn't really access the cell processor that well, and goodness knows what else. The PS4 doesn't really seem to have that. It isn't actually too long ago, in fact just the last day or two, that the developers of Dishonored have been, and I quote, found that 8 GB of RAM on the PS4 a joy. simply because they had to cut so much content out from the final version of Dishonored that the idea of actually having this amount of memory, I mean, imagine, you know, you work as a developer and you say, hey, I'd love to have this NPC here and I'd love to have, you know, this level scroll. Oh wait, I can't do that, I just don't have the memory to do it. And of course that was a major problem with the previous generation of hardware. This doesn't seem to be the case now. Also, the CPU is definitely significantly easier to program for. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a match to PC hardware, but it does mean it's going to be very compatible with PC hardware. And by match, I mean the CPU is probably going to be slower. We're waiting for exact changes, because we know that there has been some specific customizations for the AMD Jaguar that's actually on the PS4, but we don't know all of them yet. Regardless, we can almost guarantee it's going to be slower than PC hardware. That's fine. The developers of, I believe, Witcher and a few other, you know, video games have actually come on record and said, you know, that it's not going to match up, but that doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is, you don't need to be as powerful as a console to be successful. So what exactly could the PS4 have issues with? Well, the first, of course, is hardware. I mentioned previously on an Xbox 720 video, I believe, that one of the absolute crippling things for the Xbox 360 was, of course, the RROD, or Red Ring of Death. This cost them a lot of sales, and more to the point, cost them a lot of goodwill and a lot of embarrassment. That's not to say, of course, that Sony were completely scotch-free on this. The PlayStation Network hack was a massive fiasco, and of course many believed that the PS3 simply would never be able to recover to a significant degree, and indeed it hurt the sales quite a bit. There were quite a few people who sold their consoles or just simply just retired the console. In other words, it's just like, it's not really worth me selling it, it's not going to be worth enough cash, I'm just going to go out, buy an Xbox 360, or, you know, return to PC gaming, or buy a Wii, or whatever they chose to do, and that would be it. And there were quite a few people who did that. In fact, a couple of forums I used to frequent, and I have no idea how true this is, but even a couple of my friends, they said, you know what, I just can't be bothered with the PS3 anymore, and I've just bought an Xbox 360, and I've bought, I can't remember how long it was, I believe it was 12 months of gold, and that's it. No, I don't necessarily agree with this philosophy. I'm not saying you should abandon the console for one mistake. I think that's a bit overkill. However, regardless, Sony did make a couple of major mistakes with that. I've mentioned these before, including, say, the issues with the credit card and so on. So now we know that the PS4 has to avoid such pitfalls, but also hardware faults as well. As I've mentioned, Xbox 360 with the RROD, and the PS3, of course, had some issues as well. So what other stuff do we have to concern ourselves with the PS4? Well, we do know that if the PS4 doesn't sell extremely well, it's going to be quite a crippling blow for Sony. Now, we know the Vita isn't selling as well as what they'd like it to. That's kind of understandable. I mean, let's face it, the bottom line is, for many people, they didn't really know what to make of the Vita. The Vita is a really good console, I'm not, you know, trying to say it's not, but many people are kind of unsure about it. Then there's like, you know, I'm not really certain. It's even more difficult for Sony, because after all, if you look in your, you know, the desk next to you or wherever else, you can almost guarantee you see a phone. And of course, while a phone definitely cannot put up the graphics that, say, the Vita can, it won't be long until it can do that. In other words, more powerful phones are being released all the time, and who knows how long, say, the Galaxy, so how powerful the Galaxy 5 will be, or, you know, the equivalent from Apple or whomever else. There's that problem. The development costs, of course, for the PS4 are going to be quite high. That means that Sony are going to need to recuperate those costs almost, well, as quickly as possible, really. Now remember, Sony themselves have been in serious financial issues. If you don't believe me, you can feel free to do some Googling. And even Kaz Hirai, who is, of course, CEO of Sony, has admitted that Sony are in, and I quote, serious trouble. That doesn't necessarily mean things aren't improving for them, but it does mean that they have had to do some corporate restructuring. Quite simply put, some people are even speculating that they really need the PS4 to go well. An example of this, and what I mean by, really needs it to go well is, let's talk about Sega just for a moment. I really want to do a video specifically on Sega in the not too distant future, probably in the next week or two. I'd like to do it sooner actually, because I think Sega are a very great example, a fantastic example of an amazing company that just made a series of very stupid moves. And I'm not saying Sony are going down this path, I'm just illustrating a point. The Dreamcast was a ridiculously expensive project. Now obviously you know that the Sega Saturn wasn't exactly successful. I've mentioned before that it was very difficult to program for, blah blah blah, but Sega also made a couple of design choice problems as well with the Genesis or Mega Drive if you prefer. All of that meant the company was in some debt, and well, maybe not so much debt, but they weren't doing so hot. And more to the point, they lost some faith with the consumers. Then the Saturn was released, and of course, developers preferred the PlayStation 1 back then, ironically enough. And then the Dreamcast was released. Now, the Dreamcast cost a crap ton of money. I'm not exactly sure of the amounts. There have been some kind of arguments, but the rough figure is around $500 million / $500 million, which is no small amount of cash, particularly back then. And the console was initially met with some skepticism, but after the various shows, people were kind of winning over towards it, but in the end it just wasn't enough, and the company still went under. They spent so much cash developing, marketing the console, and in some people's eyes, very wrongly, and in my own as well, to be honest with you, there were extremely silly decisions from Sega. Regardless of which, the console itself was fantastic. I mean, no one can deny that both the Saturn and the Dreamcast were amazing systems. I mean, look at Panzer Dragoon Saga, look at Shenmue, which of course are fantastic examples of both systems. You can't deny the quality of the games. It just wasn't financially successful. And that was it. There was, no other way to put it. It just wasn't successful enough to be able to keep the company in the hardware market. Now, I'm not trying to suggest, by any stretch of the imagination, that, the PS4 needs an incredible amount of good fortune and, prayers to be able to be successful. However, what it does mean is, of course, even Valve now are getting into the hardware market with the, of course, Steam Box. Now, we're not exactly sure what Valve are even planning. We're not even that certain about the specifications of the console. There have been some leaked theories, but they're even more uncertain, in my opinion, than the Xboxes, the Xbox 3 or Xbox 720, whatever you want to call it. And so, to be honest with you, Valve is kind of the dark horse running in the race. No one's really sure what they're coming from. I mean, for goodness sake, Valve aren't even certain, or should I say Gabe isn't even certain if they want, biometric feedback data on the console, and it just hasn't been decided. And so that kind of thing could be extremely innovative. Now, the problem is many people are assuming that the Valve system is going to be extremely expensive. But that's not necessarily the case. We're not really certain. If it is, however, that does mean that it's going to certainly elevate it and be really great news for Sony and Microsoft. Now, Microsoft themselves have actually said that they don't really believe the Valve are, competitor. And they've actually given Valve some warnings. Say, hey, just remember this. This whole industry is not as easy as what you may think. But I personally have some faith in Valve. I'm not, a blind fanboy type of faith where I believe they can do no wrong, but I do have some faith in that I believe that they know what they're doing. Gabe is not a silly man. He has a lot of experience. He has made some wrong calls. He has, for example, said the PS3 was a disaster, and he believed actually they should scrap it, and I quote, you can feel free to Google. But he actually was kind of right in some ways, although he completely exaggerated. He merely meant that the hardware itself was not easy to really utilize fully, and he was kind of right. That isn't to say that people didn't kind of get around that, but it isn't to say that Sony couldn't have done a better job in some ways. So what we do know is Sony need to concern themselves financially right now. They, of course, hopefully with the PS4 being released, the Vita sales will also increase somewhat as well. Fortunately, the PS4 has always, or should I say the PS brand has always done very well in Japan, and pretty much all the territories. No one really associates the PlayStation brand, and by the PlayStation brand I mean the actual main systems that sit in your living room under your television, as failures. There was, of course, the previous PlayStation Portable, the PSP. It didn't do as hot as what maybe Sony expected it to. The problem is, many people associate Nintendo with handheld gaming. That isn't necessarily saying that Sony can't make some headway. It is to say that it's going to be a bit more difficult. You've also got to bear in mind that, as I've said before, developers are extremely happy with the PlayStation 4 in terms of the specifications. I've mentioned that earlier. But we're not really certain about what Microsoft are doing. Now, if Sony are lucky, the Xbox 720 will not be faster than the PS4. At the moment, it seems that it's not. It seems that the specifications are subpar compared to the PS4. That's not to say that 360 or so Xbox 720 sucks. I'm merely saying it doesn't, apparently, according to the rumored specifications, seem as powerful as the PS4. In other words, it doesn't have the GPU power, and we're not sure about the CPUs. We're not quite sure how they stack up. We do know that both are using AMD Jaguars, but we're not certain about the exact customizations that both manufacturers have used. But let's assume they're roughly even. We're also not certain, and obviously the Durango, also known as Xbox 720, is going to be using a DDR3 RAM, at least presumed, unless Microsoft once again managed to do a Sony with the PS4 and managed to sneak in 8 gigs of DDR5 instead. Regardless, all of this says that in terms of the developers are quite happy. I don't think I've actually seen a developer saying, hey, I actually don't like this console. This console's not going to be fun to develop for. That wasn't the case for the PS3. And even Xbox 360, to be honest with you. Developers said, we like the processing power, but we don't like the graphics power, or we don't like the amount of memory on the system, or, you know, X, Y, and Z. There was always one thing they didn't like. However, a few developers have said that they haven't really found anything that's really spectacular on the system. In other words, it's not exactly a unique point of the system. It just does what the PS3 does, but just better. In other words, better specs, and carries on the, you know, the logical progression, if you will, of the system. That's mostly PC developers who are saying that, as well as the odd console developer. They've just said that, you know, hardware-wise and software-wise, it's, you know, the launch is kind of what they expected. There wasn't an oh wow moment, but they are pleasantly surprised with the power of the console in terms of it's a console. So with all of that, we can guarantee. So right now, we've kind of gone through a lot of this stuff, and as I've said, I've beaten the specifications to death. So really, let's just do a quick summary. What really can be the problems with the PS4? Well, software, in other words, what the games actually are developed for the system. Fortunately, in my opinion, and obviously I'm not everyone, but my personal opinion is the launch lineup looks pretty good. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I don't think I've ever said that about any system ever. But what we are going to have to, of course, see is what exclusives Sony can now. We do know that there is a partnership of sort, and I use quotations there, with EA and Microsoft. As I've said, I don't necessarily think that that's going to mean that, say, Mass Effect 4 is going to be Xbox 720 only. It could mean, however, that, say, you know, there is a small release date exclusivity to the Xbox. So let's say, for example, a 3-month difference between, say, a particular title. I don't necessarily think it's going to be on the sports games, but say, you know, Call of Duty or whatever, or whatever game, who the heck knows. But there could be a small release date there, or maybe even an exclusive piece of DLC. I don't necessarily know if that's going to be enough to make the PlayStation 4 fail, though. After all, they do not produce every single game in the history of the world. They do, however, produce some good games. Regardless, even assume that they do that, I don't think it's going to make the major difference. So what else? Well, we've got to hope that the PlayStation 4's hardware, considering it is very powerful indeed, we are assuming, despite the fact they have used mobile parts for the most part, even Jaguar, for example, is very low power in terms of what it can actually, you know, draw electricity-wise. It's not that high wattage and so on. It's, after all, it's meant for, say, tablets. In other words, it's a device that is going to run cool. However, that still is going to be a very complicated design. There's a lot of memory in there. It's all going to be jam-packed into fairly tight space, I imagine, as well as, of course, the GPU itself. With all of that said, there's going to be rooms for something to go wrong. It's just inevitable. I'm not saying it's going to be in the numbers of the RROD, but Sony do not want any major problems. And of course, as I said before, there was the whole PSN hacking problem as well. In other words, they have to make sure that they don't do anything like that. There was another slight problem where Sony lost some faith as well, and of course that was when they removed Linux from the PS3. There were numerous reasons they did this. One of them was security concerns. Ultimately, I'm just kind of surmising here. I think that they were worried that it was going to give the developers, or should I say, you know, hackers, major access to the operating system, and possibly even the potential of running games or running custom firmware a lot easier. I'm not exactly sure on that though. I do know that the GPU functionality of Linux was extremely hampered. For the PlayStation, but I don't know if they were starting to figure out ways around it. I'm not really certain on that, I'll be honest. I don't want to speculate too much on something I'm not 100% certain of. But I think ultimately Sony's own financials are going to be a problem here. As I've said before, they're not the best in the world. That's not to say that, you know, they're in massive trouble as in they're imminently going to demise, but that is to say that they could certainly be more healthy. And compared to, say, a Nintendo and Microsoft, well, let's face it, Microsoft's pockets are pretty deep. Unlike Sony, Microsoft have the Windows operating system alone, and of course Windows is making money hand over fist. After all, they've just had a new version. Windows phones are selling fairly well, and various other bits and products. For example, Office, they've got all the server products, various cloud-based solutions. Sony, of course, do have the Xperia range from cell phones, which is selling pretty well and is actually quite popular at the moment, but their TV line and a few others have not been as successful as what they'd like. And I believe there is quite a bit of corporate restructuring going on right now, although who knows exactly how far that's going to happen. So what I'm trying to say is Sony do need to make sure the PlayStation is successful as quickly as possible. They cannot afford major financial drains. However, assuming that they can weather the financial storm, and to be honest with you, I fairly certain they will, at least the entertainment division, the PlayStation brand is always profitable. It's that simple. Most of the time, I can't actually think of a PlayStation where it's actually struggled. Even the PS3, where it got off to a bit of a rocky start, it certainly did pretty damn well. So, I would like to hear your thoughts on here. You know, how successful do you think the PS4 is going to be? Personally, I think it's going to be pretty darn successful. I don't necessarily want to predict a winner for the next generation yet. After all, we don't even know what the damn thing looks like. We don't know what the Xbox 720 is really going to be about. We don't know what unique features it's going to have. We don't know anything really other than the fact that it's going to be, you know, the next generation Xbox. We do, however, know that developers of the Xbox and, you know, some former employees of Microsoft have been fairly worried about the direction of Xbox 360 of late, because they feel that they're kind of getting away too much from the gaming side of things. We'll see if that's the case, of course. So, with all of that said, hopefully Sony will indeed continue to support developers, which it seems to be doing quite well, especially the small indie developers. It's good that they are making it easier to program for. After all, the easier it is to, say, port to a system, the less development costs there are. I'll give you another small example, once again using the Sega Saturn. Why the Saturn? Because I think it's a really good example of how a system can go really wrong despite the fact that the initial design is extremely good. Well, initial design in a very loose term here. There was actually a smaller developer, I don't know if you guys have heard of them, by the name of Lobotomy Software. And Lobotomy Software, to, well, put it very bluntly, were considered one of the best Saturn developers out there. One of the reasons for this was the fact that they managed to get Quake, Duke Nukem 3D, and of course their own game, Exhumed, running extremely well on the Saturn. There was a problem, however. The porting process, they were actually ultimately asked, I'm not sure who by, but I believe it was a publisher, to say, hey, you know what, we want Saturn Quake and we want Saturn Duke Nukem 3D, could you port it please? And they agreed. They said, yeah, sure, we can use our engine, it's a base, fantastic, great. Unfortunately, what they didn't realise is that when they were actually going to port this game, they didn't realize how much work it was going to be. In other words, they underestimated, and when they did that, it actually led to one of the major reasons that their company went bust. Quite simply put, the amount of work involved for the port it pretty much was like redesigning the entire game from scratch. It was basically that they got to use some of the original assets, and that was it. It's not just a case of, you know, a small change here and there to the code. They had to basically redesign the whole thing, and examples of that were, say, the elevators. Believe it or not, on the PC version, for example, of Quake, the original Quake, or Duke Nukem, for example, when they went into an elevator, basically the elevator would invisibly teleport the player to a different elevator that was the same size. That meant that when the game was being originally designed in the build engine, rather than the slave driver engine was their own engine that was used by Exhumed originally, or I can't remember what the US name was. I think it was called Power Slave. Regardless, I kind of going off a tangent on here. What I am saying is that when the game was originally ported, none of the geography or, you know, the actual shapes of the levels were ever meant to stack on top of each other. However, their engine did this best. Also, of course, the memory constraints on the Saturn. After all, you know, your PC back then had certainly 2, 4, 6 times the amount of memory, of course, than the Saturn did. So it just made sense that, you know, the levels were somewhat redesigned. So, of course, because of all of this, it had to be quite a lot of changes to the level. What I'm basically trying to say to you is it cost a lot of cash, and their games didn't exactly sell too well on the system anyway, which made it even worse. Who knows, if they'd actually sold pretty well, it would have been okay. But of course, the Saturn wasn't exactly doing too hot back at that point anyway. So with that, combined with the expensive cost of porting, it just wasn't really worth as a small developer to do it, but they just made the mistake at the time. So what I'm saying is that most developers have learnt this lesson now, and that's why quite a lot of time when you have a port, it's not usually 100% optimized. It's not because the developers don't want to do it. If they had all the time and the budget in the world, they would, but they don't. It costs some money to port. So anyway, hopefully you guys have at least had a little bit of fun with this video. I've kind of gone off a bit of a tangent. I tend to do that. Regardless, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I would like to hear your thoughts, and I will try to respond as much as possible to the comments. Sometimes I get asked why don't I respond to all of it. To be honest with you, we put out so many videos and we get so many comments, private messages, and of course we've got the website to run, and we both work. Well, even Murasaki and Spooner Kipper occasionally chip in on the channel, and they're working. So, quite simply put, we're usually pretty stressed for time. We do try to answer stuff, but it's laborious to say the least. Regardless, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. We really do enjoy putting the content out for you guys, and we will see you soon. Take care and bye for now.